This video is about making a surgeon's style face mask with your handmade ties. Now, I already posted one video which showed that you could either make them using a quilting method, which is to make bias tape, which is really a binding tape. You could also buy commercial bias binding tape. But this way you can make it out of your own fabrics and match your mask if you want. That's one option. I talked about spinning your own wool and making your own rope. But to warn you in advance, you should probably be more or less an expert spinner and be able to get the yarn to a consistency. This is sock yarn. It should be similar to that, with as much strength, because a lot of hand spun will pull apart. Now, another way that you can use hand spun to make a rope is in a knitting Nancy, and this is just one strand of sock weight because you don't want a thick, heavy strand, but you can use a knitting Nancy to make your own rope. Another option is to crochet a strand. This is a G hook and worsted weight wool yarn, and you just keep crocheting in a chain to make your ties. And then there's another way, which is just to buy ribbon or use ribbon. This is hand spun where the twist has not yet been set. And that's a very thin yarn that I would use 2 strands together if I were going to make rope with a lucet. But believe me, I've done it before, and you have to be careful, and it's a little bit frustrating. So a knitting Nancy, a crochet hook, ribbon, or using commercial yarn for your rope might be easier to start with. And the other things you're going to need are your fabric, 2 layers of fabric that are 8 3/4 inches by 7 inches, and you want to have them placed right sides together, which is what I have here, like that. I was going to use the model 237 to make this mask, but I'm going to do it by hand. And I'm doing that to show you this one in particular is an easy one to do by hand. We won't be dealing with elastic or anything else. You're going to need some pins, or you can use quilting clips that usually are plastic lightweight clips, or even little bulldog clips will work if you don't have pins. So the first thing we're going to do, you want to have your rope or your strands already done, 36 inches long. You need 2 of them, and they should be long enough for even, well, for a man, but also possibly for an extra large size. But if you want to go to 42 inches for each strand, you can go to 42 inches for each strand, if you know you're making the mask for someone who is big, like over 6'2" or something. So you need your fabric, you're going to need some chalk, you're going to need some kind of a ruler to draw a straight line. This is a quilter's rule, which is a 1/4 inch wide, and we're going to do 1/4 inch seam allowances. But if you can't get one of those, you can use any ruler. Needle and thread, and a pair of embroidery scissors, and then chalk or a quilt chalk marker to mark your sewing lines. This is going to be an easy mask to make. Okay, so after you've picked out how you want to make your ties, this is actually a crochet tie. I already have a ball of this done. It makes a wonderful string of any of your leftover yarns, and you can also tie it together like you can with a knitting Nancy, where you can tie yarns on. You can do the same thing with crocheting a strand. So I'm going to use that. Now, one advantage, it's faster than all the other methods. It's a little bit stretchier, and you only need a crochet hook. So I've marked off 2 lengths off of this ball by putting a knot in it, and that's the other advantage. I can now cut this and then tie a knot in this end, and it doesn't have to be sewn at the ends or anything like that. So there is our strands. Now you want to take your ruler, and you can see this fabric is off just a little bit on the left. See how it's a little bit wider at the top? So line it up at the bottom, because your goal is to have a straight seam. And of course I can trim that off of there if I want to. But as long as I line it up so that the seam is straight, I don't have to worry about that until after, when I'm trimming the corners and turning this. And if you're using chalkboard chalk like I am right now, you want to make sure you get as close to a 1/4 inch as possible. And what we're doing is we're marking our stitching lines for hand sewing. I'll have to excuse my arm for a minute. Now that's really wide, but I know I'm going to be going on the inside of that. And I can straighten it out a little if it looks crooked. Now on the bottom part, we have to leave an opening. This is just like the no raw edges mask, the fabric portion of it, where you're going to leave an opening at the bottom for turning this right side out. Now the reason you want to be as close to a 1/4 inch as possible is because of the size. So I'm on this edge, I'm going to go on this side of the chalk. Over here I'm closer to a 1/4 of an inch. I'll be going on the inside of the chalk. And that looks a little crooked, but I think it's actually the fabric that's crooked. So now you can see you have your square outlined, and start here with a needle and any kind of sewing thread. And I'm using black. You can use either black or white, or you can match it to the fabric if you want. And you're just going to start. Let me see if I can zoom that in. Go through the fabric, come up, and I did put a knot in it, but you don't have to if you do one of these, which is a back stitch. So now that thread will stay, and you can start doing your running stitch. And you can either do it 1 stitch at a time, or you can do 2 at a time, 3 at a time. Now of course you can do this mask with a machine as well, but it's always good to know how to do it by hand, just in case your machine breaks, or you're in a thunderstorm and you need to finish something. So I think you can see that showing up as the black thread. And so now what you want to do is, oh sorry, was that off to the side the whole time? I'm sorry. So here's the back stitch, and then the running stitches. I didn't realize that was off to the side. And you can see how I'm not being perfect about the size of my stitches, but as you do this more and more often, you'll get into a rhythm and they'll end up being about the same size all the time anyway. So I am sorry about that I had it focused on the wrong side. But there you see a running stitch, and you want to just go around on your blue lines now and end up over here and put a knot in the thread when you get over here. Okay, so there is the stitching done, and that may still show up as the black. Two things. When I use about a 12-inch long piece of thread at a time because it's manageable and it doesn't get twisted. And the other thing is, these two fabrics were staying together very easily, so I did not pin it. But if you're new to this, or you have a slippery fabric, I made a few masks the other day with some fabric my mother had, and it was a rayon and very slippery, and if I were doing this with that fabric, I would have needed to pin the whole thing. So now what we're going to do is just trim the edges, but not only the edges, the corners. And what that does is just take the bulk off of the seam allowance when you turn this right side out. And my cutting was a little crooked, but even when your cutting is straight, you're going to be trimming it at this point as well. Just don't cut into your stitches. And don't go so close that you're worried that the fabric might actually pull apart or anything. And then the next step is to turn this right side out. Now the difference so far between this and the no raw edges mask is that we're not fiddling with elastic. On the other mask pattern, we would have had elastic on the inside and the fabric puckers up, and it's a little bit more difficult to learn to hand sew with elastic in the middle like that. This is easier if you're just learning to hand sew. So now we pull this out. Now you can see my stitches were not anywhere near as close together as a sewing machine would have had them. But there is no way this is going to come apart. And hand sewing is very, very relaxing. No machine noise. You can do it anywhere. So now you can use a pencil, or depending on the ruler that you used, and just push those corners out. And again, depending on the fabric that you have, you may want to press it at this point. that took me about 7 minutes to sew. And then these edges will automatically turn in like that. Gives you a nice little pretty mask pattern, just like mask fabric, just like any of the other machine patterns. Now the next step, I'm going to leave the pleats for last, simply because I want to see how much fabric is on the sides. So we are going to take our ties and cut them off of a roll if we have a roll of them. And we're going to put one at the top and one at the bottom. And these you will need to pin in place. Now because this is a crochet chain, if you want to, you can try and pin it down flat so that it looks nicer. So we'll put that to the side. We've got knots in both ends of our strands. We're going to fold it in half, which should be about 18 inches long. Place the center in the center, and then let it fall on either side, and then go ahead and pin that in place. Now this is the inside of the mask. The white fabric I'm using as the lining. So you want to pin that in place. And then do the same with the bottom one, only when you get to the bottom where the opening is, use a pin of some kind to make sure that the bottom edge is all the way out, that not too much fabric got folded in. You want it to be even. So it's a good idea to press it if you're unsure or if your fabric is slippery. So once we get these two pinned in place, and I'll end up pinning them completely, the only steps left are to hand stitch with the same running stitch, hand stitch those two in place, and then we're going to decide on how deep or whether we want multiple pleats, 1 pleat, 3 pleats. But once you get this stitch in place, your mask is basically done. When you get to this part and you're doing a running stitch, you want to pin, and I'll fix this one, you want to pin the crochet strand or the strand you're using as close to the edge on the bottom as you can, because then you'll be closing this at the same time as adding the strand. Okay, this is a male head mannequin, male, and this is going to fit either men or women, but to show you how it fits, I decided to use the bigger mannequin. So those are 36-inch ties, and you put one around your neck, and then the other one goes up around the back of your head. And this, I had to do this anyway, and I think I'm just going to go with 1 pleat, similar to the fitted mask that someone else had done as far as a pattern. So right in the middle there, you put a pin for your 1 pleat. And we're going to do it on this side as well. Now I have not stitched the crochet strand in place yet, simply because I wanted to make sure this was going to fit a man with enough room on the ties. So you can see that if you make a 42-inch long tie, you're going to have extra strands unless it's for a large person. So you balance where your pleats are, you put them on the same position on the side, on either side, and basically your mask is now done, except for using a running stitch to sew the strand in place and a stabbing stitch, for lack of a better term. Just go through the pleat, all the layers, back up, back down, back up, like a buttonhole. I mean a button sewing stitch. And there's your mask. Very simple to do. Now, I do things like crocheting yarn all the time anyway. So I would have crocheted yarn around to do this. If you don't want to do that altogether, it took me, I said, 7 minutes to do the hand stitching, maybe another 7 minutes to crochet 2 strands, and the cutting of the fabric doesn't take long at all. So now we know it's going to fit. We have the placement of a pleat on each side, and I'm going to switch to white thread so that I don't have black marks all through the crochet, and it should be invisible enough on the other side. And I'm just going to finish stitching this in place. Machine washable. Someone else brought up something, and this is part of the reason I'm doing this pattern, especially hand sewing. The woman I was talking to today is from Elder Services, and they gave her handmade or homemade masks. She thinks the second week in March, because they deal with the elderly. All of the elastic on the masks that they gave her in March is all stretched out. So doing this way, this is going to last a lot longer than elastic. And especially if you spin your own wool, and even if you don't, it's fast and easy, and all you need is a needle and thread and a crochet hook and a pair of scissors. Very simple to do.